Hello, my name's Emily Day from Footprint Brighton. In this episode of our Table Talks, we're going to be talking about the role of carbon offsetting in the development of a net zero property industry. I have with me Juliette Morgan, who's the Head of Sustainable Development at British Land, and Marie-Louise Schembri from Hilson, Moran. She's a design director there. I think the first question probably goes broadly to both of you, but perhaps to Juliette. The industry as a whole has been on a long journey in terms of getting to grips with carbon offsetting. It's at sometimes been alleged that it actually has a role to play in greenwashing in what we're doing. What did British Land do to develop their principles around offsetting and how it was going to be used?
First of all, we decided it was the last thing we'd do, not the first thing. So when we adopted the BBP principles to be net zero by 2030, along with many other industry peers, we set a target of getting our embodied carbon down to 500 kilograms of carbon per metre squared. That was from a 2019 average of about 1,000, so we're trying to drop by 50%. And it's only when we've got as close as we can to that figure that we offset. So we offset at development completion. We know that we're operating with 100% renewables, so once the building's complete, we think it's carbon neutral. Mm-hmm. Now there's arguments about whether that's true, depending on whether there's fossil fuels in the building, but for our purposes, we charge ourselves £60 a tonne of the carbon that is in the whole life carbon assessment on the building at completion. So in the case of 100 Liverpool Street, which was our first net zero building, that one had 27,000 tonnes of carbon. We multiplied that by £60. We put it into a transition vehicle, and that's what we use to fund the retrofit of existing buildings and the offsetting of 100 Liverpool Street and every other development hereafter. The principles for offsetting are around nature-based solutions. You'll hear lots of people talk about that. In our case, that was around investing in forestry in Tibet and Mexico, but also doubling that investment so we actually get to net positive over the lifetime of the building into long-term carbon sequestration in the UK. It's a long answer, but it took ages.
But it sounds as if that's the answer to a very long process. So if there are organisations that are beginning to embark on this process, what are the steps that you had to put in place in just establishing your principles as to how to do this?
They were personal to us, and you'll see across the industry that some people will invest in social projects, they'll invest in energy renewable projects. It happened that we wanted to fully absorb the carbon that we put into the world, and that meant carbon absorption. At the moment, that's close to impossible to do with technology, which takes you back to trees, and that was a pathway of decision making, if you like, that we did with our consultants. We worked with environmental resource management and natural capital partners to get us to that point.
So it's those partners that you've engaged with who can help you along this process that have enabled you to learn about what the opportunities are. But again, it's also about the assessment of your existing estate to understand what you can do in terms of quantity. Okay. You at Hilson Moran help people with this process, but you're also involved with the UK GBC in having set up what might be considered to be gold standard principles and the definition of how we now understand offsetting can be used. What have you seen has changed in the industry? What have we got to grips with? What have we learned through the last 10 years of working out how offsetting can be used positively?
Yeah, I think we've learned a lot more in the last 2 years, or last year even, than we have in the last 10 years. A lot of the front runners like British Land and in the industry and across businesses across the world, the few front runners who have declared their zero carbon footprint and have worked their way to a point where they could say that, have had to find their own way, because there was some guidance but not necessarily enough to cover the whole spectrum of doubt and uncertainty and longevity of what they were saying. The permanence of carbon offsets, for example, how do you understand that? And the principles were set on a personal, business by business level. What the UK GBC has managed to do, first of all, they set a framework up in 2019, April, which was one of the most influential changes in our industry, to say, actually, this is what zero carbon means, because even now there are different definitions of zero carbon in the industry, which is one of the struggles for the new build sector, for example, going through the planning process. And more recently, in March, what they've done is, this is what is an acceptable carbon offset, and before that, this is what's an acceptable renewable energy measure, because it's a complex field, and someone needed to put it down on paper. And for carbon offsetting, they've set 8 principles of what makes carbon offsets a high value offset, an acceptable offset. But even after that, they acknowledge, and the whole industry acknowledges, that there's some things that still need to be defined and addressed and readdressed over time as certain industries and markets mature. There isn't enough third-party verification out there on what is a real carbon offset. Is it additional? Is it causing any unintended consequences elsewhere? So there's still a lot we need to do, but it's so hugely important that there's something on a piece of paper that everyone can suddenly refer to and probably realign to retrospectively. And you don't do it once, you review it every year anyway. So there'll be a few adjustments for everybody.
Yeah. Do you feel, having seen the UK GBC guidance, that there's a need for British Land to continue to align to those principles, or were they pretty similar? Had you hit on the same answer?
I think we informed some of their answer. I think one of the things that's really valuable, exactly as Marie-Louise said, is this point about annual appraisals. So within the Transition Vehicle Committee, we have a point of review annually. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is the price of carbon is changing significantly, and the price of offsets is moving around all over the place. So what might be the correct price today could well be the wrong price next year to do what you want to do. The other is the quality and availability of offsets that are out there. So I think this point about review mechanism, and also let's hope we all get past that 500 kilogram standard, and we need to revise that as well. So I think there's a number of reasons, and aligning to UK GBC, but also BBP, the various commitments that are out there, and they're not the same as each other. So that period of constant review is needed.
And is there a sense that I have a sense that it's been possible for more wealthy organisations to be trailblazers? Is there a sense that it's going to be quite difficult for some organisations to follow in the footsteps because of a lack of funding ultimately to do the right thing, because there isn't the money in the organisation, in the project, to achieve that? Is there going to be a point to which we can't, not everybody can progress down this line? How do we feel about that?
Yeah, definitely. Funding, especially during the operation of assets, of built assets, is one of the biggest stumbling blocks that we're coming across. But we're speaking to quite a lot of facilities management teams and heads of facilities management who are looking to do the right thing and decarbonise the assets on the whole, including assets in the retail sector, which have a lot of struggles at the moment. And it's a complicated thing, and it's essentially what the best way forward is, in the first instance, is to provide clarity, so there's a lot more alignment between intended operation of the building for the more recently built assets. But the huge elephant of the room is the assets that have been there for a long time and are incredibly wasteful. And perhaps there's a little bit of greenwashing even in the sustainability approaches that are being enforced on existing assets. For instance, quick wins, let's change all lights across a portfolio to LED lights without giving any regard to how long the lights have been installed for. And continuously there's a struggle for the funding for replacement, maintenance, and those sorts of things that are needed in the operational cycle. It seems that there's a lot more funding in the principles at the moment and setting things right for the new build sector, and a little bit less investment in upskilling and really understanding the buildings and the way they operate and what's actually coming more strategically from a government side, what has to change, what it's more sensible to change without adding to waste and unintended consequences of doing things a little bit too quickly without the big picture.
I mean, is there a sense that, because often we look to the regulatory environment to provide us with the cues, clearly there's lots of organisations who are pursuing these goals for themselves and for everybody ultimately. Is there a sense that the regulatory environment needs to catch up and to build upon the work that's been done by the private sector and by certain organisations?
Absolutely. We're seeing the signs of that finally as well. Not necessarily On the embodied carbon is a few years backwards, I think, from the government and regulation trying to fast track the issue, and that's quite a significant part of the new build sector impact on climate change. We're seeing the government, for example, attempting to introduce very quickly an energy rating, an annual energy rating, which is based on a new rating that a small proportion of the private sector have adopted, Neighbours UK. And it's one of the few things out there that actually looks and measures carbon emissions during the operational side of building more realistically and drives it down, more importantly. Because there's nothing that the government has done to date to address what happens after a building is handed over or is in use. So they are catching up, and they are doing it sensitive to addressing your previous question about financial, sensitive to the question of affordability across the UK for SMEs, small to medium enterprises. How can it work for it to be affordable for them? Because someone needs to come in and account your carbon, check your energy meeting, check that it's being done correctly. It's all added costs and it's all new costs. It's not something that anyone has had to do in the past. So there's some catching up. We're seeing a lot of it happen suddenly. All of it is consulted, so it might be held back. We'll wait and see. But it's quite encouraging to see the government mimicking something that was introduced by the private sector to a very small, the 1%, something very much that's only been applied to the 1%, probably in London to date, and not beyond that. And it's not fair to expect everyone to suddenly pick up and do it. So there is very small, big wins that can be done through very small investments in built assets, such as understanding the management system, upskilling staff, education, on the operation of building. So they're big carbon wins for a very small price tag.
That are worth pursuing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And that's where the emergency pressures come. That's what you do now because affordability.
They're available to people right now. I suppose one of the questions for British Land as a landlord is regarding what the demand is from the marketplace, and are you seeing much more demand from tenants in terms of the energy characteristics of the buildings that they're looking at? That's part of their wish list.
Yeah, I'd say we're getting two sources of pressure, if you like. So the first is the occupier market, and the occupiers have historically been more interested in the operational energy of a building. We've actually seen in the process of one of our transactions in the latter stage of the design process, the team focusing more, actually your project, on driving down the operational energy of the building because the tenant demanded it. So we were doing it anyway, but then we had an extra commercial push to go further. I think over time, when you get decarbonisation of the grid and 100% renewables or power purchase agreements operating of buildings, then the interest will switch, and it is beginning to switch into the embodied carbon of the building. And so we're starting to see a lot more disclosure amongst the developers of the embodied carbon. And I think that will get really interesting when an informed customer is able to compare like for like, what's the weight of this building. And then the other side of that, of course, is the investor community and the availability of finance and the rates of that finance for notional green builds. And so we're seeing it coming at us from every direction, and we're on that journey anyway, but it's really nice to feel a push from all directions. And I'd say that's been a step change in the last 18 months.
Yeah, there's pressure from all sides.
All sides.
Yeah, that's good. So what are we going to see next in the world of offsetting? Is there something that's coming up that people need to focus on in the immediate future, or is it just an organic process that we're in?
Well, I'd say keep an eye on what the UK GBC is doing for the UK. It's driven by what the World Green Building Council is doing, so it's so strategic and very much tied to the Paris agreements and the commitments we're making on a global level. So they even now they've got task groups in place to challenge what they've already written and to make sure that it's up to date. So we expect to see a lot more of maturing of the carbon offset voluntary market, so that it's more regulated, it's more aligned, there isn't so much discrepancy, that the same principles are followed everywhere, so that an organisation knows that they're getting the right thing without having to investigate and look at the background of what they're being offered. So there'll be a mark, a recognised mark of this is an accepted principle. In principle, this is an accepted carbon offset. This is a high value carbon offset. The maturing of that and other markets, the energy market for the operational carbon, is also something that needs to change, because at the moment you could be thinking you're buying green tariffs and they're not actually green because of the way certificates are traded in the industry. But that's expected to be regulated in the near future, and we've made commitments on an international level of doing that, and there are works in progress. Utilities companies are working on that. The domestic carbon offsetting organisations are also adjusting to the new definitions. So, in the next 5 years, this is all going to transform, and it will become a lot better understood by the market as well. So there's a maturing in the language and conversation of people asking for it, asking the right questions.
And ultimately a more straightforward process for those organisations who aren't specialists in the field to pursue. Well, that sounds like a bit of a sigh of relief for everybody.
I think you'll see technology as well. We've just been approached by a technology firm who is using big data and machine learning to look at the respiration rates of forests. You can actually review the carbon offset you've done in real time. So more surety of your investment and the sustainability of that investment. Probably going to see more blockchain around offsetting. And I think we'll see more direct air capture. Certainly it's coming through in the US, there's a bit in Sweden, and I imagine we'll see regulatory change across Europe to be able to do direct carbon capture. There's not enough land in the world, and even if we planted all of it with forestry, we'll absorb 10 years worth of emissions. So this direct route to trees is good for the moment, but it's not long-term sustainable. It needs complementary technologies.
There's a lot of work we still need to do on the being leaner side of things as well. We haven't really fully exploited, the being more efficient with energy use, thinking about the life cycle and the end of life of a building. That's a new conversation as well, because it ties closely to the embodied carbon topic. But we don't want to go through the same headaches that we need to go through today on whether to retain or demolish or refurbish a building, and the pains that you have to go through if you do decide to retain, and the constraints that you have to make. It needs to be a lot easier in the future to make these decisions, but now we have to address the emergency.
There's also some carbon accounting that's needed, because if you're going to invest embodied carbon to make operational carbon better, but that's 100% renewable carbon, there's a balance point at which that's appropriate to spend that carbon or not, whether it's a facade or a chiller or a lift or a series of plants. So it's not as simple, just go spend some money, upgrade the operations and meet your target.
Yeah.
And the refining of the carbon accounting process, because it's a little bit broad brush sometimes. So you're not really understanding where you can make the reduction, because you've had to, the data isn't there, so the revolution of data will completely fill in those blanks and help us to understand, actually, here are the opportunities for fast tracking the reduction, the decarbonisation. These are the medium-term objectives, and they'll be a lot more attuned with reality.
Well, I think that what we've done is set out some of the route map that people can follow. Clearly, there's a lot of work yet to be done, and people are exploring new strategies and new procedures. But hopefully, we've done a little bit to demystify the role of carbon offsetting in reducing carbon emissions from the built environment. So thank you very much for joining me. And we'll see you next time on one of our table talks. Thanks very much for joining us.